the issues that the issues that they confront is completely different from the from the state. For example, how to look at the issues of rights of people who are living on the borders, particularly when the question of the livelihood comes, or the question of the developmental issues comes. For the state, it is basically issues of development. But for the large number of people, it is not the development as such, but rather it is issues of displacement. It's issues of confiscation of the property. It's a loss of livelihood. It's a loss of identities. It's a loss of community life and other things. So that becomes an issue of that the point where the issues of the state one side, state trying to look at the issue from its own angle. The best thing is to look at the whole debate on the modernity itself. Can modernity be seen as a modernity for the common man? For example, in the 1960s, probably might be knowing about this fact, when Nehru, Indian context, he said that the big, what's called the bridges, or what's called the canals, or whatever it may be, he calls it as the temples of modern India. When he was inaugurating the Bakra Nangal Dam, he used this term called the modern, the temples of Indian modernity. But on the contrary, with the same Bakra Nangal, became a painful affair for the common man, particularly the tribals. Why that particular aspect was taken as a arena of contestation. One side, state had, even though state never used the term called the rights in that particular context, but one can derive the argument about rights in the sense that a state main argument while constructing a dam called the Bakra Nangal was that even Nagarjuna, I think, dam when he was constructing, the same argument was put forth. One is that it might increase the irrigation land, not the irrigation land alone, but also it will, irrigate more than the irrigation land, but irrigate large tract of uncultivated land in around the places, which would definitely increase the economic prosperity of the the farmers. Why I'm trying to bring it is that how do you look at the issue of a development in terms of the rights, and at the same time, how do you look at the rights from the perspective of the marginal communities? And I'm trying to look at how hybridity of the knowledge can be established in this particular context. See, the argument was that it might increase the irrigated land, probably a couple of thousands of irrigated land. That's one thing. And the second, on the contrary, it also what's called the produce. It will be helpful for the production of what's called the electricity. In other words, it would supply electricity to the different places. Most important is that it would supply electricity to the what's called the urban areas, metropolitan cities. Third important thing is that it also increase the capacity of storing the water, and that can be supplied to the urban areas for drinking purposes and other purposes. So a dam becomes a symbol of development. Dam becomes a symbol of modernity because it brings in different aspects of the modernity. Because it brings the modernity of lifestyle. It brings in the modernity of the values with the modern, because once the increases once the water is available, when the irrigation is provided to the agricultural lands, it is quite obvious that it might bring in new technology into the agriculture. This is the same argument that was made in 1960s when high-yielding varieties were introduced in Indian context. Knowing very well that 1960s, the new varieties were introduced in those places where irrigated water was available. I mean, the irrigated water or the canal water was available. And the second important thing was that it was available in those areas where the class has, has grown. One class has emerged, a distinct class which would accept new technology as such. For example, new technology of seed and other things that the farmers would accept, that kind of things. So the whole question was that a dam becomes a symbol of modernity, because it would have the multiple implications, multiple consequences. One consequence, that consequence is seen from the aspect of the state. State has its own documentation. State tried to build up its own information, and with regard to the developmental aspect, and with regard to the changes that would take place in the agrarian economy. But when it talks about the agrarian economy, it never tries to understand, will it undergo the complete transformation? Will it bring in new peasantry into the agriculture sector, or will it destroy the feudal structure in around the irrigated area, for example, in the Nagarjuna area and other things? It never said about that. See, if you look at that one, that aspect was brought in here, the developmental aspect. Development becomes a part of the right-based issue, where development becomes seen from the perspective of the state. But its consequences are completely different. At the same time, you need to see this kind of aspect of the development from the perspective of the tribals or the marginalized groups and other things. Now, I'll give you another example. For example, if you are very familiar with Karnataka, in 1960s, India government, in 1960s or the 70s, when Reza Shah Pahlavi of the Iran was ruling in Iran, Indian government, signed an agreement with the Iranian government to get the iron ore from the Kudremukh provinces, Kudremukh region of Karnataka. That particular issue finally created what's called the modernity of the region. For example, in the coastal belt, the large number of one important modernity was seen in terms of the communication. For example, Mangalore port was developed, which ultimately created condition for the development of the Mangalore, 1960s and the 70s. But that became later on, the very development of this communication, the other things, or the modernity becomes began to be challenged by the tribal groups. Why this particular tribal groups? Many tribal groups. In the case of the take the case of the Nagarjuna, even though the number of the tribals who were displaced was very, very few, but in many other places the number was much more, and they were displaced, and they were displaced in the name of the development, in the name of the big dams. There were arguments saying that the state was forcibly evicted these tribals from their inhabitants, from their locality, from their hadis and other things. Why the state was trying to displace this particular? State never uses the term called the displacement as such, but rather it uses some other terms, reallocation of the tribals from the forest region and other things. Why? Well, you need to understand one important factors. The fact is that the tribal areas are the one where which were known as the areas of the big minerals or the economic resources, where you find the large amount of resources, natural resources available in these particular cases. Even in the context of the dam construction, it was not the natural resources, but rather than their life, their community, bondage, or in that particular context, one has to see the existence of the large number of tribal population which were displaced in the name of the development, which were displaced in the name of dam construction, other things. And this is not only the case about the construction of dam. There are other factors that have violated the rights of the tribals. I'll come back to the number of rights that have been violated by the state in the name of the development. Even though the Indian state, for example, in 1940s, late 40s or the 50s, came out with the Panchatantra philosophy for the tribals, developing the tribals in their own locality and helping them and other things. This is called the Nehruvian policy on the tribals, whatever the thing. But the thing is that there are policies which also went against the tribals. One is the developmental issues. It's not the developing a dam alone. There are policies, which is not a new thing. If you look at the colonial policy, right from 1800 or 1830s onwards, that when the colonialism introduced a zamindari system. One is the colonial introducing this zamindari system, where the land becomes the private property. Here one can ask one important question. Can tribals be treated as the peasantry? Because the moment you talk about the land, then obviously where they really cultivating the land, where they settled and had all the elements of a peasantry or the farmers. This was a major debate that went on in the sociology and the social anthropology. Like, for example, I would say sociologists like A.R. Desai or Andre Bettel and others, they were trying to argue that the tribals were another name for peasantry as such. Probably this could be the reason. I'll come back why they called it as a peasantry. The tribals had all the aspect of their peasantry. And that's the reason why land becomes an important factor, because land becomes a common denominator of peasantry or the farmers as well as the tribals. And since both were cultivating, even though we have got an argument about jum cultivation, where the tribals would cultivate land in one particular place and move on to the other place after one season. So they would move from one place to the other places because that's quite obvious that they are not sticking to one particular place. And when they are not sticking to one particular place, then how do you call them as peasantry? This was a question that was raised. But since they were cultivating, whatever the time period that they took, then obviously they what's called embed all the characteristics of the peasantry. That's one thing. The second important characteristic is that the tribals is becoming, Hinduized kind of thing, which I'll come back to that one. How one can contest the argument of M.N. Srinivas with regard to the Sanskritization process as such, which is a part of the tribal, what's called the transformation taking place in Indian context. And then he explains that factor to understand the process of transformation taking place from within. Whatever it may be, but the thing is that how the tribals can be identified as a peasantry. But that was the important factor why Ranjit Guha and others probably might be knowing about the series of books that came out by the Ranjit Guha and his colleagues which is known as the Australian School of Thought. Even though they belong to this Australian National University, then later on they moved to the United States and other different parts of India. Sorry, different parts of the world. But they came out with a book called the volumes that's called the Subaltern Studies. Probably a couple of them might be knowing about that factor. If you look at the first volume, they try to look at the tribals as and call the tribals as the subaltern. Subalterns as a category known as those who are not being enlisted in history. They were the silent majority in the sense, and they were the one who were marginalized by the policies of the state and the policies of the policies of the state, as well as the colonial policy and other things. There are arguments within the subaltern studies, like for example, the Gayatri Spivak Chakravarti arguing whether can subalterns speak in the context of colonialism. Why I brought that particular thing is that subaltern studies documented larger number of tribal resistance in the context of the colonialism, whether it is the Birsa Munda revolt or the Deccan revolt and Aryans revolt, particularly in the context of the Bihar or Bengal and other places. So you've got a long history of the tribals resisting against the colonial administration, which was basically, remember that particular tribal resistance was basically against even though it's against the state policies, against the zamindars, against the middlemen who are called the Kus, or it was also against the what's called the encroachment of their land, all kinds of things. But the thing was that why this particular resistance came, and is it possible to find out the argument of rights in this kind of resistance as such? That's my hunch. That's the reason I'm taking back the whole argument of the rights back to the colonial period. Even though we might say that rights issues are basically the modern issues, it's and much debated after the colonialism, or what is called it's a post-colonial discourse narrative. Many of them would say, but I would say I've tried to bring it back to the colonial period and try to locate the rights issues that it's or being of the rights issue, even though they did not speak about the right as such, but it was quite inherent in the tribal struggles, quite inherent in the tribal resistance, and quite inherent while they were making representation to the colonial administration. During the colonial period, it was quite obvious that the tribals had absolutely no opportunity to articulate themselves, given the fact that colonial state was so oppressive and quite, also demanding, and also quite, it was trying to hegemonize over the communities as such. In that case, what is the possibility of tribals talking independently? There are two kinds of argument that was available while talking about the rights here. Can they assert their rights independent of anybody? One. The second is that was their rights were mediated through a particular agency? The question is that whether they needed or they had any agency which would translate, which would able to articulate their interests, their rights on behalf of their rights by certain agencies. That was a second argument, powerful argument. The first is that can they speak independently, or had they assert their rights independently during the time of the colonial power, colonial state, or colonial rule, given the fact that colonial state had taken away their lands, many places. by introducing different laws. For example, like when it introduces zamindari land in the northern place or the northeastern places, the land became private property. That's one thing. The second is that the land became, this zamindari land ultimately encroached upon the lands of the tribals. They were squeezed. They lost their land. Many places they lost the land. Second was that the colonial modernity, which also affected their rights exercising there. For example, like when the colonialism introduced new communication system, or when the colonialism introduced something called the railways, and it necessitated what's called the logs from the forest region, and that's the reason why the many forests were denuded, were cleaned off by the colonialism, and that's the reason why they lost their original locations. They lost their cultural practices. Many of them lost their cultural practice. Even for example, like the Second World War or the First World War necessitated the large amount of forest produce, particularly logs and others, for the purpose of laying railway tracks, because they wanted to move the railway, they wanted to lay the railway lines in different places and move the military equipments from one part to the other part, particularly after 1857. And also the First World and the Second War, to help the war machinery to get, to help the war machinery. See, what happened was that in the whole process, they lost their original, community life. They lost their original inhabitations and other things. Third important thing was that, which became also fact in the post-independence period, even in the second argument also holds good even in the post-independence period, where many of the tribals, they lost their original lands, original locations, for the simple reasons that the many governmental policy or the state policies went against them. I'll come back to that, when how 1972 Wildlife Act affected the livelihood of the tribals as such. But the colonialism did it. I mean, I think that's the reason why you need to understand the loss of livelihood right from the beginning of the colonial rule, when it introduced the different policies. One is the land policies, or agriculture policies, agrarian policies, where the land becomes the private property, where land was sold to the highest bidder, particularly in the Zamindari region, which doesn't mean that even Raitwari land area was not completely free from land alienation and other things. So they lost the lands, they lost their cultural practices, they lost their identities as the tribals as such. That's the reason why you got the series of tribal revolt taking place during the colonial period. Most of the tribal revolt can be seen in the northern parts or the northeastern part, stretching between the eastern UP, Bihar, Kuch Bihar, or the Bengal, and then through the northeast provinces, where you find these kind of struggles taking place and tribals resisting. The third important thing is that very introduction of the railways, introduction of the dams and other instrument of change, which were supposed to be the instrument of change, that also affected the tribals, tribal livelihood and other things. And even if you look at the forest wherein the tribals would find their livelihood and other things. But what happens is that when colonialism start taking over the forest and converting the forest as sanctuaries, or it converted, I mean, it made the forest as the property of the state. Earlier the tribals would look at the forest as their own, place of origin. Suddenly they were alienated. They saw the forest as the property of the state. So the huge gap between the tribals and the forest dwellers took place during the time of the colonial power, during the time of the colonial rule itself. That's the reason why colonialism needs to be, looked as a critical point in the history of the right discourse vis-a-vis the tribals. What happened in the whole process, if you look at the history of the tribals during the time of the colonial power, the colonial rule, is that they lost their land, they lost their cultural practices, they lost their identities, they lost their livelihood, they lost their, what's called social practices, and they lost the hold over the land, which is known for rich mineral resources. That's the reason why colonialism had established its stake over the natural resources. When the colonialism established its natural resources, obviously the tribals had no other way but to resist. And that's the reason why one, if you look at the subaltern studies, one can identify the area of conflict. Area of conflict is those areas where the rights issues were, indirectly debated. Even, for example, the loss of livelihood. How to look at the loss of livelihood? Loss of livelihood was seen in terms of the rights, in terms of the rights to livelihood. For example, the whole argument about the tribals' right to enter into the forest and try to depend on the forest, what's called the resources, was suddenly denied because the state converted these lands, these forest areas, as the property of the state. That's one thing. That's the reason why the issue of the right to livelihood also established, or also brought in here. Probably that same kind of argument brought in the Indian context of the independence also. For example, like one of the policies that affected the tribals in the context of the post-colonialism, series of policies that the state established or state introduced in the area of the tribal. For example, one of the policies that affected the livelihood of the tribals was the Wildlife Act of 1972. That act, and also the earlier acts which would convert these sanctuaries into a national forest in different parts of Karnataka, different parts of India. Also, one thing is that displaced a large number of tribals from their inhabitants. And that's the reason why the number grown like anything. For example, between 1947 and I think they were 2011 something. They probably more than 5 to 10 million tribals were evicted, displaced, evicted from their land. And they were denied of the livelihood because these policies and policies like Wildlife Act would deny the existence of any communities, any tribal communities, or any person living inside the deep forest. That's the reason why the state started evicting them. This is not only the policy, this policy, exclusive policy. There were other policies also, affected these tribals as such. And the second important, this is not the new thing, losing their rights right to the livelihood, a right to community life. You know, their community life also destroyed and disturbed. I would say that it was completely disturbed. They were thrown out. They became landless agricultural laborers also. They lost their livelihood. They lost their identities as distinct tribal communities, and also they became wandering communities. They became, for the colonial power. If you go back to the colonial power, it tried to claim as the criminal tribes as well. It's not simply the crime. In fact, the colonialism had no clear-cut understanding about the tribals as such. Most of the time, colonialism would construct them as enemies. Even the post-independence period, although it does not identify them as enemies, but it definitely policies has affected the livelihood of the tribals. For example, its policy on the animal protection, or prohibiting practices of or prohibiting some of the practices on animals. For example, snake chamas, or even the bears, catching hold of the bears and others. We just brought tremendous effect on the tribals, wandering tribals of India post-independence period, and that's the reason why the small policies also affected them. If you go back to the colonial period, even though Indian government has not castigated them as animist, colonial power certainly constructed them as enemies in certain places. Most of the time it had absolutely no clear-cut knowledge about the tribals. Tribals were called as the animist, forest dwellers, junglis, and other things. They were also called as criminal tribes. Suddenly the colonialists would castigate some of the communities, tribal communities of the tribes, as the criminal tribes. It is a funny policy, given the fact that the Britishers or the Europe had one policy which would identify one person who commits some crime would be castigated as the criminal, and at the same time the whole community was castigated as criminal tribes. And the same thing happened in the context of India. Many tribes were castigated as the criminal tribes, and that stigma remained with the tribals. Very stigma, probably we need to understand this fact. Stigma of criminal tribes was seen as a form of denial of the rights also. Very stigma is essential. A very stigma, literally denied these tribals their, right to livelihood. For example, if you say that they are the criminal tribes, the moment you say that they are all the criminal tribes, then obviously nobody would entertain. Nobody would provide them the jobs. And that's the reason why that stigma literally denied hundreds of communities of their livelihood, of their basic rights to live as a distinct social categories. So we need to understand how colonialism constructed. Did the Indian state constructed this kind of argument, this kind of nomenclature of the tribals, even though there is a debate with regard to the nomenclature in Indian context, but we have been using them as Adivasis. State is using the category called the Adivasis. Even what's called, there are others, they've been arguing about that. But whatever it be, state in India, in the post-independence, had absolutely no ambiguity with regard to defining the tribes. But the very definition of the tribes depends on how there are certain factors which would enable the state to call particular community as the tribes. That's the reason why this is a long process. One, the state has to identify certain factors, certain matters need to be identified with the community. Then only state can call this what's called the tribes. But here, how to look at the rights of the tribals? One side, if you look at the history of the violation of the rights, which is quite obvious given the fact that the colonialism started this process of violating the rights, particularly taking over the land, bringing in the policies, new different policies, whether the land policies, agriculture policies, or zamindar system, or introducing the code. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello. I'm trying to look at the post-independence period. You need to understand two or three things. One is the policies of the state, particularly the developmental policies, ultimately affected the tribal livelihood and the tribal rights. The second important thing is that somebody's talking. Yeah. The second important thing is that certainly some of the tribal communities, they resisted against the state policies, which ultimately culminated in the culminated in the enactment of the Forest Dwellers Act in recent years, particularly 2000 decades. Why this act, in one side, necessitated the state to enact this particular bill. And also, if we look at the earlier acts, such as, for example, like PESA Act, which was trying to protect the tribals, particularly those tribals which are in majority in particular area. That's one thing. But if you look at the Forest Dwellers Act, which was trying to protect the historical rights of the tribals, particularly their the right to livelihood, right to live, right to enter into the forest, right to their traditional knowledge system and other things. Because there are certain things which have been debated here also. For example, indigenous knowledge system itself. The whole question is that state needs to recognize this right of the tribals to preserve this indigenous knowledge. The second is to protect, not only protect, but also to practice their indigenous knowledge system. Whether the state would protect this kind of knowledge system, but this can be done only when state documents this kind of rights, this kind of knowledge system available among the tribals. The most important thing is that whether the tribals should be allowed to live in their inhabitations, in their place wherein they lived in for many centuries. For example, the Forest Dwellers Act would say that if you are prepared to prove that you lived in that particular locality for 3 generations, you can claim the what's called the place as your property, as well as the in that inhabitations. But the thing is that there is one debate came out in this particular context, particularly with regard to whether the the tribals would be comfortable with the property, because the notion of the property never was a part of the tribal identities. Unlike the farmers, farmers always lived with the land, land as the property, land as the identity maker, land as the symbol of their cultural practices, land as the a symbol of their diversity and other things. But the tribals, private property, even though they lived in the land, they lived on the land for centuries together. But the land never became the denominator. This is a kind of argument. The land never became a denominator for the identity of the tribals. Tribal identity always derived from the forest. So their rights most of the time derived from the forest. Forest encroachment, forest interaction with the forest, living in the forest, living in the nature, free movement within the nature and other things. So they had the complete linkage with the forest, and that's the reason why the celebration of the rights, it is said that, would be when they are given full right to enter into the forest and depend on the forest produce for their livelihood. It's a minor forest products, basically about the minor forest products. When they enjoy that kind of things, or when they pick up or collect that particular minor forest product for their livelihood, then only they'll be able to enjoy their rights. If not, then obviously their rights are denied. They will be denied of exercising their right, which also be a fact in the context of natural resources. There is a river called something I don't remember now. I'll come back to that one. That river was privatized in Orissa, I believe. That river was privatized. Shivnath, yeah. That river name was Shivnath River. There are many rivers which have been privatized. When that river was privatized, the tribals argued that they had lost the right over natural resources. Earlier they had all the right to catch the fish, which was a part of their livelihood. Earlier they had right to draw the water for their irrigation facilities, or that water was used for their everyday life practices. Suddenly, when the river was privatized, they lost their right over the river to catch the fish, which affected their livelihood, which stopped the flow of water to their land, irrigation land, and which also stopped using their land for the drinking purpose and other things, which obviously mean that a privatization of natural resources, this is also the case in the context when mines were given to the multinational corporation. For example, this is the major debate taking place in the context of the Orissa and Bihar, when the bauxite industry was given to the private sector, MNCs. What ultimately happened was that it affected the livelihood of the tribals, because it displaces one thing is that it displaces the large number of tribals from the minor, what's called the mineral resource rich areas. The second is that suddenly you have these private parties entering into their location, which ultimately created the condition for the conflict, which also created the condition for the narratives on the rights. The narrative is that their right over the natural resources was lost. Their right to move around the places was also lost. For example, this kind of argument was made in the context of the special economic zones. Unfortunately, special economic zones were not established in the tribal belt, which was basically they were established in the places where transportation and other communications are available. The whole question is about the when these kind of policies were brought in, for example, one policy about the liberalization policy, which was, affected them drastically, because the liberalization policy, allowed the private sector to private parties to enter into the areas of the tribals. As I said earlier, tribal areas are rich with the mineral resources, and that's the reason why their entry into the tribal areas, ultimately affect the livelihood, the community life, and social life, and other lives of the tribal. That's the reason why liberalization policy had the consequences on them. That's one of the important factor. Other factors like the other state policies, whether the policy of converting the forest into the national forest, or declaring particular sanctuaries or the national forest at the area of the wild traps, and other things, subsequent laws and other things that ultimately created conditions of the displacement of the tribals. And that's the reason why their right over the forest, and other areas were lost. This is one of the reasons why the state initiated the Forest Dwellers Act, where the rights of particularly their historical rights were recognized. The historical rights is the right to inhabitations, a right to property, right to the what's called their traditional knowledge, the right over the what's called the burial grounds, and other kinds of rights. They were all established. They were all recognized. The second important factor that helped the tribals, I won't call it to help them, but rather that was introduced, keeping in mind with the presence of the large tract of the tribals, was the PESA Act in 1995 somewhere, and it recognized which is nothing but it's recognizing the tribal what's called the right over governance, local governance, and other things. The third important thing is the declaring the areas as the scheduled areas in different parts of India. In the moment you declare that scheduled areas, which is meant to protect the rights of the tribals. Now the question is that there are two important questions. One is where do you locate the conflict on? The conflict is when both define their rights. When the state defines the rights, or a state defines the issues in terms of its own perspective, which ultimately affected the livelihood of the tribals. The second is that the tribals trying to redefine the rights. For example, how to define the right over the forest? The right over forest is to allowing tribals to enter into the forest, collect the minor forest products, or destroying the alienation between the forest as well as the tribals. Allowing the free movement of the tribals to reclaim their lost heritage, lost cultural practices, and other things. So that becomes a point of conflict, and that it was in this point of conflict you find the violation of the tribal rights of taking place, or the complete suppression of the rights of the tribals. But the question is that, has it been able to, whether these rights have been, when compared to the Australia and other, where the tribal rights have been recognized, tribal courts have been recognized. Like, for example, even in the case of the Canada, even there are attempts to, for example, that tribal, Forest Dwellers Act try to recognize these kind of rights. But the question remains that why the tribals remain the most backward community in Indian context. Still, they are considered to be most, poor, backward, economically backward, and socially also backward communities. And that's the reason why they're not being able to exercise their right properly. They're not being able to enjoy their rights. Or most important thing is that they're not being able to celebrate their rights, given the fact of violation of the rights taking place in Indian context. So the whole question is that why they're not being able to enjoy these rights? Because the one important thing is that large number of policies coming in the way of exercising their rights. The second important thing is that the loopholes, the ambiguities in the policy itself has not been able to solve the problems of the tribals, or the ambiguity within the policy itself has coming in the way of exercising or celebrating these rights. For example, like Forest Dwellers Act, which says that you have to prove that you stayed in a particular locality for 3 generations. Given the fact that the tribals have no documentation, has no habit of collecting or retaining the documentation or the documents in black and white, how do you expect them to prove that they're leaving that area? And that's the reason why they are lost. The third important is the ambiguity within the policy itself. That it says that your inhabitation, the area of inhabitation can be declared as the property of the given over to the tribes. There are 2 kinds of rights. One is that community rights and the individual rights, and the community claims and the individual claims. But the thing is that the property, I'm taking the argument of Thorat with regard to the SCs, the Dalits, but I'm also relating it to the tribals. Why tribals remain most economically backward communities in Indian context? This is mainly because the land that has been given to them, or the claim over the land for the last couple of years, even after the independence, or even after introducing the land reforms in Indian context, has been very, very small. It's a small patches of land. And that too, that land which are very, very uneconomical. When the land is barren, when the land given to them was barren or it is unfertile, how do you expect the categories emerging as economically a strong community, economically very strong class? How do you expect the change of the tribals from a economically backward community to the economically powerful community? It's not possible. That's the reason why the very nature of the policies, nature of the implementation of the policies has gone against them. For example, this giving the small patches of land has gone against economic interests of tribals. Third important factor that has affected, which was, one can say that they're not being able to document, they're not being able to celebrate, is the fact of the effect of the globalization, effect of the liberalization, effect of the modernity. What happened is that it has affected the identity or the cultural practice of the tribals. And that's the reason why, and that has affected not only the cultural practice, but everyday life practices of the tribals. So if you ask them, where exactly is your cultural practices? Tribals would say that, they would say that they cannot remember their original cultural practices. It has become either the hybrid practices. That's the reason I started with the whole argument about the hybridity of the knowledge. Hybrid practices in the sense that the practices borrowed from the modernity, the practices derived from the globalization, the practices derived from the, what is called the industrial, cultural industries, like the movies, cinemas, dances, songs, and other things. So the cultural practices derived now from the cultural industries, and also the cultural practices, the remnants of the cultural practice of the tribals, which constitute what's called the hybridity of the cultural practices. So in other words, there's an argument saying that the tribals have emerged as a hybrid communities, neither totally modern nor totally identified with the tribes. So in this midst, one has to locate the exercise of the rights or celebration of the rights, and also the loss of rights and the violation of the rights taking place among the tribals. That's the reason why in Indian context, understanding the rights of the tribals needs to be understood from the point of view of the tribals, more than from the state, the colonial state or the post-independent state, where the state tries to look at the rights in terms of its developmental aspect, developmental goals, rather than the violation of the rights. And that's the reason why we need to understand a new perspective for the narrative or the discourse on tribals with regard to the rights. Thank you very much. I'll get back to you after 20 minutes. I think after 11:45.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll come back after 11:45.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yep. Oh, are you there?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm here. Thank you, sir. One of the wonderful session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'll see you later on. Okay.
Okay, sir. Okay. Thank you, sir.
I need your address. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes.